All right. Good morning and welcome to this virtual program of the Missouri Historical Society and Soldiers Memorial. My name is Mark Sunlove. I'm the director here at Soldiers Memorial. And this morning's program, Beyond the Gates at Bellefontaine, the Civil War, will be presented by Dan Fuller. It'll be an engaging look at the Civil War aspects that can be found up at the Bellefontaine Cemetery. So I think you're going to enjoy this. While this program is virtual, I'd like to remind you that both the Missouri History Museum and Soldiers Memorial are open. Soldiers Memorial is open Wednesday through Sunday from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. We have several safety precautions in place and are complying with the city's mandate for mask wearing indoors. However, outdoors, you're more welcome to remove that if you'd like. And we would certainly love to have you visit if you do feel safe. And I want to give a special shout out and thank you to the members of the Missouri Historical Society. Your support is always appreciated and always makes a significant difference in the programs that we're able to develop and deliver. And so thank you for your support. If you are not a member, but are interested in becoming a member and enjoying some of those benefits, there is a link in the chat. It's mohistory.org/support, and you can copy and paste that link into your browser. Just a quick review of kind of how today's program will run. It'll be roughly 30 to 40-minute presentation, followed by some 10 to 15 minutes for some Q&A with Dan. And you can submit questions through the Q&A button in your toolbar, which you'll find either at the top or the bottom of your Zoom screen. And please know that we'll do our best to get to all of the questions if we can, but if we do run out of time, we do apologize. Dan will be sharing his email address in the chat box. So if you have a question that may be specific to your family or maybe specific to some concerns that you have, Dan invites you to connect with him in that way. Today's presentation will be recorded, so if you have friends or others who you think would enjoy this, you certainly can share that. It'll be posted in the Missouri Historical Society's YouTube channel, and I will also post that in the chat box so you can find your way there and find not only a recording of this presentation, but presentations that we have given in the past. So you'll find a lot of interesting programs there. Your feedback is always important to us. We would appreciate it if you could answer a few questions following the program. A little what's called a Kobo toolbox survey will open in another tab in your browser immediately after the program. So if you keep an eye out for that, and if you just take a moment to answer some of those questions, we certainly would appreciate your feedback. And now I'd like to introduce Dan. Dan Fuller has been active with his family history, tracing his own family back to the 1840s in St. Louis and the 1640s in the New World. His approach to family history includes learning about the time periods of his ancestors, which gives him a particular insight into the everyday lives of people of historic St. Louis. In addition to being active at Bellefontaine, Dan is a docent at Tower Grove House, the country house of Henry Shaw, which in turn became the Missouri Botanical Garden. Additionally, Dan has been a docent for many house tours in the Shaw, Lafayette, and Compton Heights neighborhoods. Dan is also an active member of the 1904 World's Fair Society and a certified member of the Professional Tour Guide Association in St. Louis. And not only is Dan a master guide, but he's also the Bellefontaine Cemetery volunteer and event coordinator. And Dan was here at Soldiers Memorial previously this summer, and I would just thank you, Dan, for your participation in that U.S. Grant Symposium that we hold every year here, and certainly attest to your both the interesting nature of your presentation and also the skill that you used to deliver it. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Dan. And Dan, I'll stop sharing here, and you can take over the screen responsibilities.
Thank you, Mark. All right, let me bring up my presentation and then we'll get started. right, well, I do appreciate you guys joining us today, and specifically what I'll be looking at is the Civil War as it relates to those that are laid to rest at Bellefontaine Cemetery. We are located, of course, on Broadway, and as part of the rural movement, we are exactly 5 miles from the old courthouse and not just too much further from Soldiers Memorial. That would have been a hour buggy ride in 1849. The thing that I double back for is that we have a little bit of a moniker here at the cemetery where every stone tells a story. However, not every story has a stone. And I do want to give a shout out to all of the volunteers that we have. We have over 120, and without their help, presentations like this would not be possible. So jumping right into the Civil War, and specifically here in St. Louis. And again, there's many different opinions and factions about the Civil War. I'm just going to present it from my standpoint. This is not for a debate. This is just as I have kind of seen it and identified it. But early in the conflict, city of St. Louis was trying to identify what side it would come down to. And a couple of the very key players, Claiborne Fox Jackson and Nathaniel Lyon, and specifically the Camp Jackson right above him, and Benton Barracks right above Nathaniel Lyon. We'll talk a little bit more about that, and as it actually will become the beginning of the Civil War for us at Bellefontaine Cemetery. But before I go any further, I want to bring up the fact that when we began all of our Civil War dialogue, we really got into the deep conversation of the appropriate flag, because we wanted to secure the right flag to fly whenever we did a presentation. And so sitting with the Civil War Roundtable, we identified that the 7-star Confederate flag was the one that flew for the longest period of time. And so whenever we do a Civil War tour, we do fly these two flags to represent that we will be talking about both sides of the conflict. And then these last two flags, which give some correlation to what many people correlate to the Southern flag currently, shows you where that came from. But for us, it is the 7-star rendition that we focus on. Camp Jackson, and again, as with many times in St. Louis history, is a little bit of a misnomer because it really doesn't really come down to one day. The greatest loss of life definitely took place on May 10th, but there were skirmishes and loss of life throughout this time period, the spring of 1861. But what most people know about is the Camp Jackson affair and the situation where it is going to be decided by people that we will talk about a little bit further, that St. Louis is going to stay a Union stronghold. And so at Camp Jackson, which is basically where St. Louis University is today, the Confederates are surrounded and without much turmoil will surrender. But it's during the march back to the arsenal that something does happen, a shot is fired, and at the end of that, there are 30 St. Louisans dead. What you're seeing here now in the upper photograph is what's known as Public Lot 16, and there are 129 burials there, but only 2 pieces of memorialization. This goes back to the not every story has a stone. And what I believe is, I believe the people who were laid to rest here during this very beginning opening curtain of the Civil War, their family had every intention of coming back to memorialize, but 4 years of Civil War will ensue. And so they are somewhat forgotten about. You can see that the date of death is on the left-hand side, and then the date of burial is on the right. Of course, there's a little bit of a disparity with that as arrangements are being made and things of that nature. But you can see that the Camp Jackson affair will lead to other events that will take place. That's where I want to point out Nathan Pratt, who actually died as a St. Louis City police officer. He was blocks away from where a little infraction was taking place, and he was killed from a random shot that came down and killed and took his life. The other thing I wanted to do, and I actually changed my program up just a little bit because this marker just arrived at the cemetery, and if you're paying close attention, you'll notice it's in memory of. That means this is a cenotaph. Peter Joseph Osterhaus is not buried with us, but in the midst of the Civil War, his wife died and he secured a family lot. And again, I think with every intention of being buried there himself, but other things would take place. He would become a consulate to France. He would mend his fence with his home country of Germany. Was actually buried in Germany at the time of his death. But through recent volunteer efforts, both internally and externally, we were able to petition the United States government, and they created the cenotaph to give a place to recognize this very significant general of the Civil War. Now, our presentation is very different because it is soldier and civilian. And after I just talked to you about a soldier, I'm going to talk about a civilian in the form of John Richard Anderson. He is the Baptist minister who will actually count among his congregation Dred and Harriet Scott. And he is actually with Elijah Lovejoy at the time of his death up in Alton. This very charismatic Baptist minister died in the midst of the Civil War in 1863. And when his funeral took place at Bellefontaine Cemetery, over 150 carriages came from downtown St. Louis, bearing both white and black, to lay him to rest at an unsegregated cemetery in the midst of the Civil War in a slave state. His Dred Scott connection is definitely that he was a mentor to the Scotts. Nobody knows for sure where the concept will come about to carry out the court cases, but this would have definitely been somebody that the Scotts would have talked to in great detail about what they were experiencing and going through. Edward Bates, very significant individual. He is our Attorney General to Abraham Lincoln for the first 4 years of the Civil War. He is a local man who actually ran against Abraham Lincoln in the Republican primary. Now, this is our friend Edward Bates, and for many St. Louisans, they don't realize that they've been looking at him at Forest Park. This is the statue of Edward Bates that's basically at the bottom of Art Hill in that roundabout that you can go through. Now, the other thing I do want to point out is Edward Bates's home was a house divided. Of his 17 children, he had 5 boys of age of the Civil War. 4 fought for the Union cause and 1 fought for the Southern cause. He did leave Abraham Lincoln after the first 4 years, and he was back here in St. Louis. He had basically kind of ruined his financial situation by taking the Attorney General's spot and had to come back to St. Louis and go ahead and liquidate some assets. Very significant, along with Nathaniel Lyon on that Camp Jackson outing, was General Francis Preston Blair Jr. Always important to do the junior because, of course, Francis Preston Blair Sr. is very significant in the Civil War in Congress. He is known to a certain extent as Abraham Lincoln's hatchet man down in Congress as things need to be run through Congress. He is definitely a flashpoint in Congress. And in St. Louis, he is present at not just the Camp Jackson affair, but he is also doing some reconnaissance before it. There's this wonderful story, and I can't prove it or disprove it, of potentially he or Nathaniel Lyon taking a tour around the Confederate encampment dressed as a woman in a buggy. And I find that very hard to believe with Preston Blair, only from the standpoint that the man used to smoke 30 cigars a day. And I think a woman with a cigar sticking out of her mouth would have been quite obvious. That's Francis Blair. And this is his statue, also in Forest Park, basically facing the Chase Park Plaza at the intersection of Lindell and Kings Highway. Henry Taylor Blow. We have a tendency at the cemetery of talking more about Henry and his daughter, Susan Blow, the creator of the kindergarten, but he is a significant individual in this time frame. He is one of the 3 Blow children who are financial support during the Dred Scott cases, but he is also very politically connected. During Abraham Lincoln's tenure as president, he is ambassador to Venezuela. Later on, under U.S. grant, he will become ambassador to Brazil. And so very forward thinking, and reading ahead, you'll see that he was born in Virginia, had very Southern roots, but did not believe in the institution of slavery. And there's Henry Taylor Blow. You'll notice that I'm flipping back and forth, and that is pretty much the way the cemetery is. Much of my presentation will follow a pathway, and so there is not a southern side or a northern side within the cemetery. They are throughout. And so here we have Edward Burdell, who is a casualty. I'm hearing that my audio is a little bit weak, so what I'm going to try and do is, if I can't boost my mic a little bit. See if that helps, and I'll also try and speak out just a little bit more. Edward Burdell is a part of Mosby's Raiders, and he will die toward the end of the Civil War. The most interesting related story to him is the fact that when his parents met his body coming back to St. Louis, they actually rushed him out to Lafayette Square where they had a home. Prior to this time, other Confederates had been whisked away by the Union provost and buried in unmarked graves. They did not want that to happen with their son, so they did bury him in Lafayette Square and actually will place rose bushes on top to make sure that he wasn't disturbed. Later on, the family will secure a lot at Bellefontaine Cemetery and will have him removed from Lafayette, moved to the cemetery, and then they will join them later, of course. This is now a Medal of Honor recipient is in the form of Brunel. Brunel is from an action very early in the Civil War. If we have some real Civil War enthusiasts, Elmer Ellsworth will be a name very familiar as one of the very first officers killed in the Civil War. And he was Burdell was one of Ellsworth's men who actually will go over to the hotel that a Confederate flag is waving from. Ellsworth is killed, and in kind, Brunel will take the life of the hotel owner who took Ellsworth's life. He will, sometime later, receive the Medal of Honor, which is a new accommodation at this particular point in time. And he is somewhat sidelined by Abraham Lincoln for the duration of the war, as he will be used as a poster boy, we'll say, for the Union cause. Whenever trying to raise funds, he will use Brunel's actions as kind of a rallying point. We have 10 Medal of Honor recipients at Bellefontaine. 8 of those are from the Civil War era. So there's Brunel in his wonderful uniform. Isidore Bush, again, flips to the civilian side of things and is specific to the fact that we are a non-sectarian cemetery. And so if you're looking right above the Bush name, you will see Yiddish, Hebrew, or this is an Orthodox Jewish burial. Isidore was very involved politically during the Civil War and would be a voice for the Jewish people. Since he had fled Germany, he was very much an abolitionist, and so he kind of made sure that the Jewish vote in the city of St. Louis would go with more of a Union side. Captain Campbell is an interesting individual in the fact that he's, like many people of this time period, very multifaceted. He is and will become very much well known as an attorney. He came to St. Louis specifically to study under Charles Drake, who you'll see here in just a little bit. But one of the things that we don't have written here at the top is Gibbon Campbell is in command of the small group of men who will escort Jefferson Davis in the last 10 days of his presidency. Once Gibbon Campbell is captured along with Jefferson Davis, the Civil War does officially come to an end. This is all, of course, after the surrender of Appomattox. There's a picture of Gibbon Campbell. If you come to the cemetery, Gibbon Campbell is in a very well seen spot directly across from our chapel, which is more on the Broadway side of the cemetery, which is the true original front of Bellefontaine Cemetery. Now we're going to take a couple of twists and turns. This is a woman, as you can see, who is alive during the Civil War, but the person who is most associated with what we're talking about is her son, who is the author of the Crisis. This is a best-selling book well after the Civil War. And its connection to the cemetery is multifold. Emma Churchill, the mother, is buried with us. But at the time of Emma's death, Winston will become the ward of a gentleman named Joseph Gazan, who is the secretary treasurer of Bellefontaine Cemetery. So in many ways, Winston Churchill grew up in Bellefontaine Cemetery. He knew the stories, he knew the people who were there. He was very connected. And that's important because in the book, The Crisis, which is historic fiction, he will interweave many of the factual people like William Tecumseh Sherman and U.S. Grant, but it'll also create fictional characters like Stephen Bryce. However, much of what Stephen Bryce did in the book, The Crisis, someone you'll meet in just a little bit in the form of Henry Hitchcock, did in real life. And it's my belief that the cemetery itself became fodder for Winston Churchill's writing. Now, everybody knows that the most visited person at Bellefontaine Cemetery is William Clark, but what many people do not realize is Meriwether Lewis Clark, which was the eldest son of William Clark, is equally important in our St. Louis history. He is a general in the Confederate Army, and he is in charge of raising troops. The O'Fallons, the Farrars, many of these early families were in fact slaveholders and found themselves on the secessionist side during the Civil War. So when you do come to the cemetery, you'll see a designated marker for William Clark, but there is another marker there, and some people blend that to think that's William Clark as well. But in fact, that is for Meriwether Lewis Clark, his eldest son. There's a very prim and proper photo of Meriwether Lewis Clark. Not to leave the women out of the conversation of the Civil War, we have Adeline Cousins, who was a volunteer, but became part of the St. Louis Union Aid Society and will travel with soldiers to the siege at Vicksburg. And in 2 instances, she is even wounded. After the war is over, she will petition the United States government and actually received monies from the United States government for her wounds suffered for actions during the Civil War. The 2 injuries, just to let you know, she was servicing soldiers on a battlefield in a very cold time period and will receive frostbite. And then at Vicksburg, she's close enough during the siege that she is hit with scrap metal from a bombard. Interesting twists and turns throughout St. Louis. And so Frederick Dent is laid to rest with us. Prior to Frederick's death, his wife had died before him and was buried at Whitehaven in South St. Louis. But with the death of Frederick, it was decided that the family farm would be sold off. And so in order to do that, those family members who had been laid to rest would have to be disinterred and reinterred. And so on the day that Frederick Dent was laid to rest at Bellefontaine Cemetery, his wife and then 2 grandchildren were also laid to rest. We're pretty confident in saying that U.S. Grant was present when his father-in-law was laid to rest and probably made many of the arrangements for the service. There's a picture of Julia, the daughter, on the left, and then Frederick Dent there looking not too terribly happy in that particular photograph. We mentioned Charles Drake before, very important lawyer in and about St. Louis, and his impact is really felt more so after the Civil War than during the Civil War. He is the one who will impose the Golden Law, the Drake Doctrine, which made Reconstruction much more difficult in our state. He is a very interesting character. I've got a photograph of him. You can see, again, very prim and proper, of course. You can definitely read him as an attorney. He has very definitive opinions, is driven a particular direction, is kind of my way or the highway. And ironically, he is basically facing the next person I'm going to talk about. He's right across from this individual. General Albert Gallatin Edwards is a member of William Tecumseh Sherman's battle group, and he is more of a finance person. He's the one who's in charge of payroll, buying supplies, and things of that nature. His brother, Ninian Edwards, had married a Todd, and it is thought that Ninian was instrumental in introducing Abraham Lincoln to Mary Todd. And what we have is near the end of Abraham Lincoln's tenure, he is going to appoint assistant treasury position here in St. Louis. And so he did give that to Albert Gallatin Edwards, of course, of A.G. Edwards fame. And I find it very interesting that the Edwards and the Drake markers are basically right across from one another in the cemetery. And when we say things of that nature, a lot of times that means that there are some type of connections, either through business or through marriage. And so far in the research we've done, I've really not found too much of a close companionship between Charles Drake and A.G. Edwards. I am going to pop back now because this is a very important part of our story at the cemetery, and the fact that James Buchanan Eads is laid to rest with us. Again, not a soldier, but more of a civilian, is very instrumental in the Civil War in a very significant way. He will build the first 7 ironclads in the Carondelet shipyard just south of the city of St. Louis. Now, ironically, James Buchanan Eads does not own the Carondelet shipyard. He is basically renting that from Primus Emerson. But Primus is a Confederate and has been basically ushered out of the city of St. Louis. Now, once our friend James Buchanan Eads is finally paid by the Union government for his 7 ironclads, he will pay and settle all of his bills, which will include rents paid to Primus Emerson on utilizing the Carondelet shipyard. Our friend James Buchanan Eads was very, very adamant about not profiting from war. And so he wanted to make sure that when his books were cleared, there was no profit from whatever he did for the war. Those funds between paying all of his bills and what profit there was, he will donate to war relief for both the North and the South. And there's, of course, Eads Bridge, which is so synonymous with our friend James Buchanan Eads. And then, again, just kind of reiterate Primus Emerson. Very hard to read this monument. This is marble. We had determined in the 1880s that marble does not stand the test of time. And so rules and regulations specify that all memorialization now must be granted. Roswell Martin Field, also buried with us. Dred Scott, just as a point of reference, is buried at Calvary. I will tell you that's not where he started at originally, but that is where his final place of rest is. But Roswell Field is with us, and he was one of many attorneys that were in the multiple Dred Scott cases. Now, Roswell did see an opportunity to do pro bono work for this very significant case. He definitely saw that this was going to have incredibly important ramifications, and so he wanted to be a part of that, and to ensure that he was a part of it, he will do that without any cost to the Scott family. There's a portrait of Roswell Field that you can see if you go to the Field House, which is a museum just a couple of blocks down from our baseball stadium. Hamilton Gamble is probably the most significant politician that we have outside of Edward Bates. He was our provisional governor during the Civil War. Claiborne Fox Jackson, who I showed you a photo of before, had been elected by the citizens of the state of Missouri. But once he declared his allegiance to the Southern cause, that created a vacuum. And it was Abraham Lincoln who worked with Edward Bates to secure Hamilton Gamble as a provisional governor. Now, the dotted line connection there is that Edward Bates and Hamilton Gamble had married sisters, and therefore Hamilton Gamble is the brother-in-law of Edward Bates. So Hamilton Gamble. Now, an interesting little byproduct and what happens when you get to know some of the historic places in St. Louis. We just mentioned the field house for Roswell Field. Well, it turns out that the field house owns the bed of Hamilton Gamble, and it is on display. Thornton Grimsley is an example in my transition into one of the reasons why we're really focused now on doing a new Civil War booklet. Thornton Grimsley, when I first arrived at the cemetery, was somebody that we knew of as a true secessionist, and that though he will produce, and his sons after will produce the Grimsley saddle, which is utilized mostly by the Dragoons and the Union officers. Now, we saw him as a secessionist, but what we've also now found is, and you'll hear a little bit more about her later, but we found on our grounds an enslaved individual who was freed by Thornton Grimsley well before the Civil War. So as with many people, politics and beliefs will change. And so where we used to think from what we had seen, we had a true secessionist, we had somebody who I think was in turmoil and was making a change in his life as the United States was making a change in its life as well. This is one of the things we like to talk about at the cemetery is the fact that sometimes we don't have the person, we have somebody associated with the person. So here we're talking about Elmira Hancock, who is the wife of Winfield Scott Hancock. Winfield is not buried with us. He is buried back in Pennsylvania. And Elmira is with us because she is a local girl. She's a St. Louis girl. And the mausoleum that you're looking at is actually known as the Russell Mausoleum, owned by her parents. And what we've been able to identify so far is that the two decided to be separated in death to be able to, for Elmira to be buried with her son here in St. Louis, and for Winfield Scott Hancock, he would be buried with his daughter in Pennsylvania. So we have Winfield on the left, and Elmira was known as one of the beauties of Jefferson Barracks when they were both stationed there. I mentioned Henry before. He is what I consider to be the model or the role for the Stephen Bryce character in Winston Churchill's book, The Crisis. He was on William Tecumseh Sherman's staff, and he did see action through Georgia on the march through the sea. After the war is over, he'll become one of the first deans of the School of Law at Washington University and is elected to a position in a newly formed American Bar Association. Here's a proper picture of Henry. Again, proximity. We do not have the person who is most associated with this story, and that is because his body was lost to the Mississippi River, and that would be Captain Mason, who piloted the Sultana being still the worst maritime disaster in American history. Mary Rowena is with us because she married Captain Mason, but more importantly, James and his wife were basically the owners of the Sultana. We have one of our wonderful volunteers researching our steamship captains, and this story is again changing and evolving. We thought initially that Captain Mason was within good standing of James Dozier, and it turns out at the time and the sinking of the Sultana, there had developed a rift. And at this point in time, the Sultana had no ownership connection to Captain Mason. Joseph Nash McDowell, one of the more interesting characters of St. Louis at this point in time, was very adamant that the new territory of California should be its own free and separate country, and built munitions and armaments for that cause. And when the Civil War broke out, will give those armaments to the secessionist cause. Because of that, he's basically taken out of the city of St. Louis as a secessionist, and his medical college is turned into the Gratiot Prison. This is a drawing of what the Gratiot Prison would have looked like in the Civil War era. Margaret McClure, again, to flip back to the women's side of things, is going to be one of our secessionists. She's known as Mother McClure. She was known to have been running an underground mail system for the Confederate cause in and about St. Louis. For a period of time, she was under house arrest, and things became so bad that they did finally usher her out. After she came back to St. Louis, she will be one of the founding mothers of the Daughters of the Confederacy. Mother McClure. Another very controversial person, and anybody who is aware of the Civil War and some of the stigmas of the Civil War will know of the Palmyra Massacre, which took place just outside of Hermann, Missouri. General McNeil was in charge basically of that component of Missouri and will order an execution of 10 Confederate prisoners of war as something that Abraham Lincoln considered one of the darkest days in Civil War history. What I find most interesting, and this is where I can double back to my friends here, of course, Soldiers Memorial is a part of the Missouri Historical Society. If you go into their website and Google Palmyra Massacre, you can actually read some of the letters of the men who were put to death that day. And they were allowed to write letters home to wives and children, and they're very moving pieces when you stop to think about how this person composed himself to write this last letter to his wife. There's General McNeil. Virginia Minor is going to end it for us. This will be the last person I'll talk about. She, much like our friend Adeline Cousins, was a part of the St. Louis Union Aid Society, but she really did not have the skills and abilities that Adeline had to go off to become a true nurse, and therefore she never left the city of St. Louis. She stayed here and tended the soldiers that were coming to St. Louis in the many hospitals that we had. But it's at this point in time, at the close of the Civil War, that the passage of the 13th and 14th Amendments will trigger a concept for Virginia. And for the balance of her life, she will work to secure the right to vote for women. And so on basically the heels of the Civil War, you have a new action that is getting ready to take place. And this is very important, especially for the old courthouse, which I referenced as being 5 miles from. The Dred Scott case will originate there, and the Virginia Minor case will originate at our courthouse in downtown St. Louis. In both instances, these will ultimately end in amendments to the Constitution. And so it is for both of those cases that building is on the National Registry of Historic Places. And when it comes down to the actions and the court cases that took there, that is probably in the top 10, both of those cases, Virginia Minor and the Dred Scott case, are probably within those top 10 cases heard in that. And so there's Virginia. We're going to wind down. I just want to point out, if you haven't been to the cemetery, that this is Hotchkiss Chapel. This is a functional part of the cemetery. The chapel is a functional part of the cemetery, allowing families to have their services there. But on the backside of that is a receiving tomb, and that's where your loved one would be laid to rest until the spring thaw. And that, for the cemetery, took place up until the 1950s. In the 1950s, we finally bought a piece of diesel equipment, and we could bury any time of year we wanted. Our white line, our new white line, actually came right in play for COVID. So we found many thousands of St. Louisans coming to the cemetery to take self-tours. They follow that white line, and whenever they see one of those arrows, that would point out a person, piece of horticulture, a piece of architecture of some note. We are part of the North City Corridor in an attempt to try and give back to our community. We have identified a need for infant burials with infant mortality so high. And so we created first Garden of Angels and now Angels Rest. And we will give parents who have lost a child under the age of 2 a free grave marker. If you come to the cemetery, you'll come to this main door, and to the right of that, I will you'll find a lending library box, and that's where you can secure your self-guided tour. And then just a couple more images of the cemetery. And I did catch that there's another question. I'll get to that in just a moment, and I'll put up my email. But I do want to reference these are the folks that I was able to secure many of these images from. And at the top of that list, of course, is my friends at the Missouri Historical Society. All right, so let me stop sharing there and kick over to some questions. So what I'm seeing is, may I ask for you to give some additional details on the court case involving Virginia Minor at the old courthouse. What she started with is she actually went for U.S. Grant's election to ask for a ballot. She knew that she would be turned away, and so she took her husband Francis with her, and that would start the multiple cases that will eventually lead to the Supreme Court of the United States. So that all began at the old courthouse, not just the court case, but even the action of asking for a ballot. And it's at this point, I'm going to go ahead and put up my email. And as I have found in doing Zooms, sometimes there's general questions that everybody wants to hear about, but then there's also some specifics. And so this gives you an opportunity to ask some specific questions I can get back to you, especially if it relates more to family or something of more personal nature.
Dan, I had a question.
Sure.
Well, first of all, thank you very much. It's just some of these stories are just incredible, and to think that there's such a rich St. Louis history and all these connections and to this amazing history, and I think that through the cemetery, it's such a unique and interesting way to dig deeper into history and to learn these individual stories. So thank you for sharing all of that. I wanted to ask, in-person tours have resumed, I assume, at the cemetery?
We quite honestly did not stop. We just made sure that all of our touring was done by foot, so walking. So we've been walking throughout, and we did at the beginning of September bring back our trolley, but because of again COVID, we've done half capacity. So all of those tours can be found on our website. Go into our calendar.
And do people need to make advanced reservations for those tours?
Advanced, yeah. And again, that allows us to keep all of our tours to a defined number. That way everybody is comfortable from that standpoint. We usually do walking tours at 15 to 20, and then our trolley, which normally holds 24, we're capped at 12.
Great. So the virtual presentation is great for the information, but certainly the experience of being in the cemetery is something that everybody should experience. I would.
The cemetery will talk, and again, it is a more of a talk of feel and inspiration than anything else. And again, with all of these types of presentations, we're just scratching the surface. I kind of consider myself the Cliff Clavin of the cemetery. So a little bit here, a little bit there. Wonderful researchers, which I think Dave Brown was on here. I noticed his name before. They can go into so much more depth. My job, as I see it, is picking some of those very interesting tidbits and weaving that together to kind of spark people's interest and maybe dig a little deeper. I'll use the Palmyra Massacre as a prime example. Most people do not know about it. It is one of those, like I said, even Abraham Lincoln said, one of the darkest days in Civil War history, and its action and cause is just completely, unbelievable. And yet, if you go to Palmyra, Missouri, and you stand at the courthouse to the left, you'll find a statue of a Confederate soldier in the name of all 10 men who were put to death. So, if you're in Palmyra, you know all about it. If you're in St. Louis, you've never heard of it.
Right. We may have, don't have any more questions at this time. Let's see. Give people just maybe another few seconds here to hastily type their question in and see if something comes up here.
Yeah, we still have a fair number of folks on. So. I see Dave Brown in the mix. So.
Dan, how what are the nature of the tours? Are the tours mostly thematic like this, like one on the Civil War and one on other aspects?
In non-COVID times, we're a little bit more formulated. Right now, people just want to really get out. And so, for example, we're doing our fall leaf walks, and it's more of a general overview. And it is a mixture of talking about history and horticulture at the same time. When we started doing the tours back in 2014, the focus was really just on the history. But as many people who come to the cemetery are interested from a horticultural standpoint. And that's where I do mention the fact that we are a Class 2 Arboretum on Morton Society scale. So even though we have a wonderful relationship with the Missouri Historical Society, we have an equal relationship with our friends at the Missouri Botanical.
Excellent. All right. Well, I don't see any more questions. I'm going to put up a slide real quickly just to bring awareness to some future events here at the Historical Society and the Soldiers Memorial. I can find the right slide here. There we go. These are actually tomorrow. So there's a couple of Halloween things happening tomorrow up at the Missouri History Museum, which is in Forest Park, of course. In the afternoon, 4:30 to 7, it's a kind of a healthy history loving Halloween party, they're calling it. And that's for adults and children, a family orientated event. And then in the evening, ghost stories and guitars, a concert that will be happening at the History Museum, 5:30 to 8 p.m. Those again are both tomorrow. And then next Saturday, November 6th, we are really excited to announce that the St. Louis Veterans Day Parade is returning. Of course, last year, the parade, we did not hold the parade due to the pandemic. It does return this year in person. It will begin at 10:30 down close to Union Station and proceed to Soldiers Memorial. And then immediately following the parade will be a concert and a ceremony with the United States Air Force's Band of Mid-America and their Star Lifter ensemble, which is kind of their pop and rock ensemble. So a couple of things coming up. And then again, thanks again to our members. And for those interested in becoming membership, there is the website there. And then also, again, please be aware that you'll get a pop-up in your browser for a survey. If you could please complete that, that would be greatly appreciated. Check one more time for questions, and not seeing any. Dan, I think I will thank you for all your time and energy and effort into the presentation, and just want to say thank you. So, and we'll call it a day at that.
All right, I appreciate being able to be here, and we will talk to you in the future.
All right, thank you, Dan.
All right.